In this tutorial we're going to look at brushes within Substance Painter. So by default we have just a normal layer, so just a basic layer there, and straight away we can just kind of click on a brush and we can start painting in. Okay, it's worth noting that if I use a fill layer, we can't actually paint onto a fill layer directly. We have to go about that a different way depending on what we want to do. But if we just use a normal layer, we can just paint on that. So I'm going to just get rid of this fill layer. Start working with this. So down in our shelf we have brushes, and these are just presets. And the presets are essentially just different variations on the basic parameters within the brush itself. Some using different alphas, which I will talk about as we go through this. But first I'll just go through the basic brush settings. Another thing that's worth noting is the fact that what we're painting here is dependent upon what we have in our material. So currently I'm painting in red because I have my material color set to red. So these two work hand in hand. So if we go into the material, just click on this material here to get the properties up. So the only thing I have in there in terms of the channels currently is the color. But if I was to go in and add roughness and say height on this, just boost my height up a little bit on there, maybe take my roughness down. Then what I'm doing now is I'm painting in these properties. Okay. You can see on that I've got a little bit of height on that. If I take the height up even further and maybe take the roughness, so we have no roughness, we're now painting in those properties. Okay. So note that it didn't change our original paint that we set when we were painting with barely any roughness and only a small amount of height. This kind of updates as you paint. So you set the properties out, then you paint, and it will paint with whatever properties you set within that. Okay. I'm just going to erase this for now. We can just press 2 on the keyboard and we can bring up our erase tool. Just rub it out. Press 1 and we're back to our paint tool. Okay. So I'm just going to go back to what I had before. I'm just going to click off the height and the roughness and just work with the color channel just for now, as we're working on just the basics of this brush. So to get back to my brush settings, I can double click on a brush. To choose it, we can just click on this brush box here and that will bring up the settings for this. So just to go through the basic parameters of this. The first one we have here in terms of the sliders is the size. And you can actually see a preview of this as we're increasing the size up and down. Okay. Another useful thing is that actually we can just paint in here as well to get an idea of how this brush will be working, which is really useful. We have a keyboard shortcut for this. If I press Control down and my right button, and I just move that mouse left and right, we're increasing or decreasing the size there as a shortcut. Okay. So the next one we have on that is the flow. So again, taking this up and down shows you a little preview. I can paint over this. So the flow is going to start out whatever value we have, and then as we paint over it, we're going to increase going to take up or take out the opacity essentially. So we're going to build up the strength of that. Okay, so start out a little bit, then we build up. Exactly the same as the way that Photoshop works. Again, we have a keyboard shortcut for that, so Control and left mouse button. And what I can do is move left and right, and that's going to increase the flow. So if we take that to 100%, we have 100% flow on there. Okay, take that down. Taking our flow down, we have to build up that color. Okay. Again, just back to my eraser. I want to go back to my brush. I'll just actually set the flow back up. So Control. There you go. We have a stroke opacity. So unlike the flow, when I set this down, this is going to remain at this opacity value, so it's not going to build up even when we paint over the top. Okay, so when I'm going back over this as I'm painting a continuous stroke, it's not building up the strength of that. I can then go back and paint over it to build up the strength, but the initial stroke isn't. It's all staying at that standard opacity, so 25% of the opacity on that. Okay, do that. Keep going too far. So the next one we have is the spacing. I'm just going to take this opacity back up. Spacing on this, so what we can do is we can increase the spacing, and you can see on here that this is going to give some space between our brush strokes. Okay, so I can paint something out. For the angle, you won't really show any difference on this, but we can just change the angle around. Obviously this is a circle right now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and choose another alpha, which will be more apparent of what this is doing. So let's just double click on this, for example. So you can see we've got an alpha, and what this is doing is it's just using whatever brush we're using, but it's only painting within this area. So this is determining where the brush can paint. It's essentially a mask, but just built out for just one stroke. Okay, so with this one, if I change the angle on this, see that switching around. Okay, just change the spacing up on this, you can see it a bit better. Change the angle on that, and you can actually see that changing round. Okay, and again we have a keyboard shortcut for that. If I press Control and left button but go up and down, we can change the angle. So going left and right changes the flow, going up and down changes the angle of this. Okay, painting. So they are the basic settings: the size, flow, stroke opacity, spacing, and angle. We also have these different options. I'll go back to follow path in a second. These different options for adding randomness to our paint strokes. So we have these jitter options. So if we go in the size jitter, what this is going to do when I start painting out, let's just bring the spacing down a little bit. When I start painting out now, it's going to have different variations of size as we paint that in. What I might do is just click to my brushes, just go back to my standard brush, and that will load the alpha in for that particular brush. Show on my settings. If you want to reset that, just double click back on it, and that loads a different alpha back in for that particular brush. So paint in there. What I might do is just click to something like this dirt. Okay, so our size jitter, it's just going to change the size of our brush. Maybe actually going back to the alpha that was on kind of shows that a little better. Okay, the flow jitter is going to be the transparency. So if we take that up, we're going to have different flow on that. Let me just check the spacing up again. Okay, so some are going to be more opaque than others on there. We have angle jitter. So this is going to have this as different rotations as I paint out. And then we have position jitter. So it's just going to place these randomly as we paint over. Okay, made a bit of a mess of that. Okay, so it's just spreading that out a little bit more. So what I'll do, I'm just going to create a new layer. I'm just going to delete the contents of this just quickly. Just a bit quicker than erasing it all out. So that's our basic parameters within there. We have a couple of other options as well. So the one that I was kind of glossing over just earlier was this follow path. So if you're doing something when you're painting out the stroke, I'm just going to make sure all my jitter values are down. Take my spacing up a little more. Okay. So if I'm painting this out, let's just take the spacing down a little more. Okay. the alpha isn't pointing the direction that we're going. As we're painting round, what we'd probably want this to do is follow this round to so kind of automatically rotate this. If we're doing something like stitch detail, for example, we don't want the stitches to all be pointing in one direction. We want them to flow in the direction that we're painting. And that is exactly what this follow path does. If we just click this on, then what this is going to do now is follow in the direction that I'm painting out. Okay? So the alpha is going to rotate according to where I'm painting. So that's the follow path clicked on. Other things that we have in here, we have the alignment. So this is just how it's painting onto different surfaces, and the way that it's actually painting on. Let's go back to my brushes. Let's maybe take a dirt brush. So by default, this is clicking to a tangent wrap, and this just means that what it's going to do is it's going to allow the brush to follow around. And again, I might just show this in an alpha, make a little more sense. So when we start going round, changing over the surface normals, okay, you can see that brush will align itself to the object normals there. So if I go kind of over that, it's going to paint over both of the sections of this. Okay, like that. We also have a tangent planar. So what the tangent planar is going to do, kind of the same thing. It's still following the normals round, but just the way it paints is slightly different. And you can see that this is the one we did before, this is the one we did after. And we just probably better to go to a cleaner area on this. So let's click back to tangent wrap. Just kind of go around the side there, paint that in. So it's taking that the whole way around. Let's go on our tangent planar. Try to do a similar kind of thing. Okay, you can see we've got a different sort of effect on there, and it's just the way that it's wrapping round that this alpha is working on the other surface. Okay, you tend to find that it sort of stretches out a little more as it goes around the edges, whereas the alpha on tangent wrap just prints the alpha as it is. The other options we have in there are camera. So with the camera, this is now going to be not based on the normals. It's going to be based on the position of the camera. So wherever I'm painting this, you can see now that it's not sort of rotating to go around and follow the object normals. You can see when I change the camera around, it's kind of positioning it this way. So if I wanted to put something perfectly on there, let's just change the size of this. Okay. I can get the camera into the right position and then place that where it needs to be. I've got some position jitter on this. Let me just take the position jitter down. There we go. There we go. So wherever we have the camera placed, it's going to do it from that angle. So it's no longer based around the object. And that can be useful sometimes if you do want something in a very specific place, to get the camera point in the right direction and then just paint on. Now our final one on that is UVs. So for example, if I was to go in, I'm just going to change my brushes over again. Let's just go in here. Actually, let's just go in here. So if I wanted to paint on something like this section here, and I only wanted to paint this bracket, I didn't want to paint part of this. If I go into this currently, start painting, when I go around there, it's going to start painting over, and I'm just going to, it is back on tangent wrap, okay? So it's going to paint over that section there as well. Now there's a couple of ways we can try to solve that. One is this option here. We have this backface culling. So on the backface culling itself, which is switched on automatically, this tries to alleviate that. So it's working on 90 degrees by default. With something like this, we may have to just lower this down. And you can see now when I paint, it's not getting this area here. If I just take that up, See, when I paint, it's actually getting some of the bottom edge as well. So what the backface color is doing is kind of ignoring anything that's under that angle there. Okay. This is useful if we're painting along the edge of something. So if I paint like this, just paint down the side, we're painting over the edge there. If I take this value down, it's trying not to paint over the edge. So it's kind of ignoring this back face here. Okay. And another way we can do that in this instance, if I was doing something like this, let me just erase this bit here. So say if we're painting, but we just want to paint on this surface, I have this up, and we can't kind of do it with the surface normals. We can do it with the UVs. So if I go into my UVs, I'm not going to use a keyboard shortcut just because of the recording software. So I'm just going to go up to, where are we here? I'm going to go into the 2D and 3D. Okay. And what I can do instead is use the UVs to paint on. So you can see on this, I've got this UV shell separated out for this particular part of our mesh. If I go in here and if I just do it at the minute and paint, then we're still going to be able to paint on the other surface. You can see that going over there. But if I go in and make sure I'm on my brush, change this to UV, what that's going to do is only allow me to paint over that UV island there. So it's not painting on anything else, it's only painting on that. And that can be really handy for painting sections in. Okay. So those are the options for painting in. Let me just switch this back to 3D only. There we go. The final thing on that is the size space. So with the size space on, just switch this back to tangent wrap. By default, this is an object, which just means that if I have, and I will switch back to another alpha. If I have an alpha, size this up, and I paint this on, it's going to stay at that size, whatever the alpha is. So if I want to change the alpha size on something, then I have to actually size that down. Okay. But if I switch this over to viewport, then what happens is the texture, the alpha, sorry, remains the same size, and it's all dependent on where the object is in the viewport instead. So if I just zoom in, try and get this roughly the same size, you can see around here we get a similar size of alpha. But if I start zooming out of this object, so the alpha remains the same size, but the object is further away. So what we're doing is painting a bigger area. Similarly, if I zoom in on this, we've not changed the size of the alpha or the brush, but you can see it's smaller. So it's dependent on the viewport itself. Okay. Click that back to object. And they're the basic parameters of brushes. The only other thing with brushes, which I was mentioning about, was the alpha itself. And what you find is we have a set of alphas in here, and you can double click to load these alphas in. Just double click and they will load into the alpha slot. And we do have different parameters for these alphas depending on what type of alpha it is. So these are all Substance Designer created, and you can create graphical versions of these as well. You can get these free from a lot of places. ZBrush, Pixologic do a lot that you can download for free, but these are kind of parameterized, so we can change some things in there. So if for example, I go back to my standard brush. Okay, see I've got this default hard brush and soft brush, and that hardness or softness is all down to the alpha, not the actual brush. So in here you can see I've got this hardness value for this particular alpha, which is set down to 0. If I take that hardness up, notice that the brush has got a harder edge now. Okay, dependent on that. That is also a keyboard shortcut. Control, and it is the right button, and if I move the mouse up and down, so left and right is a size, up and down is a hardness, and you should see that going up and down there as well. Okay, so we can control that. If we get rid of the alpha, if we don't want any alpha on there, it gives us a square, okay, by default, which we can't really do anything with. That is just a square, just brushing in. We need an alpha to give some shape to that. And that's essentially what all these things are doing. So these brushes here are just using certain alphas, procedural alphas, to create the textural side of the brush. Okay. So that is the basics of brushes. Just working with the layers, the different parameters, and just things you can do with them.